Hello. I had the opportunity this last weekend to participate in the Shamrock Open at the Boylston Chess Club in Cambridge, Mass. It was a 4-round game in 60 tournament in a really nice looking chess club with caricatures of all the world champions on the wall and pictures of famous players who have visited the grounds. So it was a nice experience. And the Boylston Chess Club has a lot of very young players who are strong for their age. And I was paired against one of those players in the first round. I had the black pieces against Kelsey, rated just over 1800. And she appeared to me to be somewhere around 10 years old, which would make her extremely strong for her age. I'm sure within a few years she'll be significantly better at this game than I am. But she led with e4. I played e5. She played knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. This is the Roy Lopez. I played a6. And after her bishop a4, knight f6, castle kingside, and bishop e7, we have just kind of gone deeper into the main line of the Roy. But she played queen e2 here, a move I'm not familiar with. For all I know, this is theory, though. So I just decided to make some normal-looking Roy Lopez moves and hope for the best. I played b5, bishop b3, and d6, guarding my e-pawn, and freeing up my knight to go attack and ideally trade itself for the bishop on b3. She played c3 to prevent that. Now the bishop can go back to c2. I castled kingside, and she played d3. I think I was a little bit more afraid of d4 here. But there's nothing wrong with this move. And now white can maneuver her queenside knight over to the kingside and get the usual Roy Lopez kind of activity on the king side. At least that's the opening as far as I understand it. I played knight a5, bishop c2, and c5, an idea I've seen in this opening before, but I have no idea if it's good here or not. I just wanted to move that knight away with tempo, making her bishop retreat to c2, and then take more space on the queen side, after which the knight can be moved back to c6, but now black has a pawn on c5 instead of c7. Bishop to e3 from Kelsey. I wasn't a huge fan of this move because I think white, as I said earlier, should be moving this knight over to the king side. When she plays bishop e3, especially without this g4 square being guarded, she opens herself up to the harassment of that bishop. And after my knight c6 and her knight bd2, the bishop has nowhere to go after knight g4, so I'm able to trade knight for bishop, which I think is a plus for black. She played h3, and after knight takes e3, decided to play f takes e3, opening up her rook on the f-file. I played king h8, and it's possible this move wasn't very good. I wanted to play d5 at some point, but if I play it right away, then after e takes d5, queen takes d5, the bishop's coming back to this diagonal with tempo, and then the bishop and rook are going to be hitting f7. I didn't like this very much. And I considered bishop to e6, trying to prepare d5, but I thought white would play d4, threatening a piece-winning fork on d5. And if I capture twice on that square, let's say, this bishop's not doing very much on e6, it has nowhere good to go, and white's threatening d5. And if I play e5 here, d5 myself, then after e takes d5 and d takes e5, I might be just down a pawn. Yeah, I couldn't really find a good way to go here. So I decided to play for the move f5 instead by putting my king on h8. She played bishop to b3, targeting this now weak f7 pawn. Makes sense. And I played bishop e6, looking to trade light squared bishops, reduce the pressure on my king side, and then continue with f5, unless she trades on f6, of course, in which case I will be challenging her on the then open f-file. She played d4. I traded on b3, and after knight takes b3, I played f5. So things, I think, have gone reasonably for black, and I was pretty happy with this position. There are two nice central pawns here on e5 and c5, which are adequately guarded by minor pieces and by another pawn. And I'm taking space on the queen side, and at some point may play f4 or take on e4, and I may get some activity against her king. She took on f5, and after rook takes f5, played king h2. Okay, somewhere in here I think there might have been a good tactic for her, which she either didn't see or thought didn't work. It wasn't quite here. I played queen c7, putting my queen on the same diagonal as her king. She played e4, I played rook f4. She played d5. I played knight a5, offering a trade. She retreated her knight to d2, and now I played c4, and I think this is the position. She could have played knight to d4. If I take that knight, of course, she grabs my rook on f4. Although, is that all that bad? Now that I look at it, maybe there's bishop f6, and I'm threatening bishop e5. Okay, I'm not sure. But that's what I was worried about. And if I take on f1, she throws in the in-between move knight e6. When, if I move my queen away, then white will just recapture the rook on f1. Material will be equal, but white will have a very nice knight on e6. And I could play rook takes a1 here, but then after knight takes c7, rook f8, I'm threatening to maybe go after these pawns on the queen side, but the rooks are not doubled. They're not protecting each other. And they have a hard time doing that because white's knight controls the f1 square. So I wasn't too keen on getting into this, though it might have been okay. So that's, I think, a missed opportunity for white here. She instead played g3, and I jumped at the opportunity to get my rook back to f8, where it was well guarded. And rook f2 from white, knight to b7, and the point of the earlier c4, I forgot to mention, was to free up the c5 square so that that knight could use it, and even use it as a transition square on its way to d3. Rook a to f1, king g8. As long as the king sits on h8, there are some back rank tactics sometimes. So I thought, why not bring the king back to g8, guard f8, and eliminate the back rank checkmate threat. b4 from Kelsey. I took en passant on b3, and now if she takes back with her a pawn, then I could play knight to c5, and if she decides to play b4 at some point, c4 becomes very weak and c3 remains weak. So she took back on b3 with her knight, trying to stop knight c5, but this means the pawn on c3 is a big weakness. I elected not to take it right away because, excuse me, that would have allowed rook c1, which activates a white rook. I played queen b6 instead, taking a look at this rook on f2 and making it so that it's even less likely she has any favorable tactics, because if I need to, I can play rook takes f2 check, and the only way she would redevelop a threat on the f-file is to take back with the queen, but then I can play queen takes f2 check. So there shouldn't be any good tactics here for white at this point. She played king to g2. I played rook a to c8, going after the c-pawn. And at this point, I think black has a clear advantage. White is going to have to passively defend the c-pawn, and that shouldn't work out. Queen to d3 guards the c-pawn for now, though. Knight c5 activates the black knight, of course, and the knight may come into a4 and put more pressure on c3. So she took the opportunity to trade on c5, which makes a lot of sense. I played queen takes c5, and she played rook c2. So white's pretty passive now, and black has a clear idea to move the bishop back to d8 and then over to b6 when the queen, the bishop, and the rook will be hitting the dark squares on the king side really well. I played bishop d8, she played rook f to c1, and I played bishop b6. Okay, I expected her next move, c4, and my plan was to play b4, just to keep things as they are, and force white to keep finding moves that don't allow some kind of invasion. But then I realized that I can just take on c4. because if rook takes c4, queen f2 check, king h1, rook takes c4, something takes c4, and queen takes f3 check wins a piece for black. Whereas if queen takes c4, as in the game, I have the move queen e3. When white would like to play queen takes c8, but I'd have had the in-between move queen takes f3 check, and after rook c8, I'd be up a queen and a bishop for 2 rooks. So she retreated to f1 with the queen, which hangs on to all the pieces, but does not guard the pawn on e4. So I played rook takes c2 check, rook takes c2, queen takes e4, and this, I think, is winning for black at this point. This double pin is pretty nasty. The pawn on d5 is not defended. The pawn on e5 is protected and passed, and the bishop on b6 is very active. Rook to c3, bishop to d4. There's no real concern about putting the bishop on d4 here because the knight is pinned in more than one way. She made a nice counterpin here with queen c4, and now of course if I take the rook on c3 I drop my queen, but I had the move queen f5, getting out of that pin, threatening once again to play bishop takes c3, and knight takes d4 doesn't work because of queen f2 check, king h1, queen e1 check, king somewhere, and rook f2 checkmate. So she played rook c1 instead. I think she had to keep defending the knight on f3, of course, and get the rook out of the way. So either rook b3 or rook d3, at which point I was going to try to find a way to play e4, possibly after anchoring the bishop on c5. But she played rook c1, and that allows the capture of the knight on f3, king h2, and I'm embarrassed to admit I couldn't find a checkmate here, so I just kind of lazily played queen f2 check, king h1, queen takes g3, and after her queen to e2, I really wanted to play rook f2, which hopefully would have forced mate, but I didn't want to allow any kind of counterplay, which might happen after rook c8 check, king f7, and queen h5 check. So I just played queen takes h3 check, queen h2, and traded queens. Wow, now that I'm looking at this, right away what jumps out at me is rook f1 check, which mates on the spot. Rook takes f1, queen takes f1, queen g1, queen g1. I should not have missed that. I traded on h2 and played rook f2 check, and after king g3 took the pawn on a2. Rook c8 check, king f7, king g5, or king g4. I'll just show you the rest of the moves of the game. King g6, rook e8, h5 check, king h4, backing the king away from my h-pawn so I can play king g5, and then anchoring the bishop on c5, holding on to my d6 pawn, advancing my kingside pawns, going after the remaining white pawn, and then just kind of shoving the a-pawn up the board. She checked me on g3, and after king f5, resigned. Alright, so I was at 1 out of 1. And at this point had to run back to my car because the lot I parked in allowed parking for $1 an hour, but only for 3 hours at a time. So I was already 15 minutes late, 15 minutes beyond the time I was supposed to be there, so I ran back and luckily hadn't been ticketed yet and paid for 3 more hours. Mike Stevens was there too, and he won his first round game. And we went to lunch afterwards, and then we got back in time for round 2, in which I was paired against Evan Welsh, who's rated 1767, but had beaten a 1900 in the first round, so was looking like somebody who was possibly underrated. I played d4, he played d5, and after c4, c6, we have knight f3, knight f6, we have the Slav defense, excuse me. I don't really know what to do here, so I decided to play queen c2, just denying him the f5 square and expecting that he'd take that pawn on c4. He instead played e6, which looks a little passive to me, but it's hard for this to be terrible. I played e3, which is also passive. Probably should have done something else instead, but I thought I'm higher rated, I'll probably, find a way to play for an advantage later in the game, so why take any chances that he knows some piece of opening theory that hurts me here. I played e3, he played bishop to d6, and I played bishop to d3. Knight bd7 from Evan, and I castled kingside. He castled as well, and I played knight c3. And immediately we get to a really critical move in his e5. And this is a sign that Evan is playing very well, I think, because he's looking for a way to equalize as quickly as he can. He's not afraid of a higher-rated opponent. He's looking for either his e5 or c5 break at the first opportunity. And I looked at this for a while and couldn't really figure out how to emerge with an advantage, which kind of made me think that I had misplayed the opening. But I eventually settled on going c takes d5, c takes d5, knight b5, and in between moved to hit this undefended bishop on d6. And I don't think black had time for e4, because after knight takes d6, e takes d3, queen takes d3, white is up a pawn, and there's no revealed attack on the knight that goes after the queen because white's capture of that knight would defend the knight on d6. So he had to retreat his bishop to b8, and I took on e5. And the idea of going down this line was to leave black with an isolated queen pawn, with me having a reasonable amount of control of the square in front of it. The downside, though, is that this bishop on c1 is not a very good piece, and I had a hard time figuring out what to do with it for the rest of the game. He played knight takes e5. Yeah, and here I didn't want really to take on e5, though I think this was played in at least one Grandmaster game, and that's what white did. But I also didn't want to allow him to take on d3, so the only reasonable option I could find is bishop to e2. He played bishop g4, though, and now he's threatening to mess up my kingside pawn structure by forcing g takes f3 at some point. So I played knight bd4, making good on, or kind of capitalizing on the plus side of having played knight b5 to begin with, which was to get another piece focused on that d4 square. So now he can't double pawns on the king side. I've got a nice knight on d4. And was thinking that I had a reasonable advantage and that I would be trading a few pairs of minor pieces and looking to play against this isolated queen pawn. But he played queen d6, and I started to get worried. At this point, he is threatening to, let's just say white makes a nonsense move. Let's give me bishop d2 or something. Black can play knight takes f3 check, and if I take back with something other than my d4 knight, he has queen takes h2 checkmate. But even if I take back with my d4 knight, he can then play bishop takes f3, and this wins a piece because if I recapture on that square, there's still checkmate on h2. So I said, uh-oh, maybe I really misplayed this. But I found a way to keep going and to keep him with an isolated queen pawn. I played knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and g3. There's no time, of course, for bishop takes g4 because of queen takes h2. He played rook c8. It's an active move because it activates the rook and kicks the queen off the c-file. But he and I were thinking after the game that maybe bishop to d6 here was a better idea. And then he could bring the other rook to c8, which would leave him the option of putting his kingside rook on d8 or e8. But rook c8, queen d3, and bishop to h3. I'm not a big fan of bishop h3 because white wants to activate this rook anyway. But as he pointed out to me after the game, queen h5, which is kind of a move black should be looking at here, doesn't do a whole lot because there's bishop takes g4, knight takes g4, and now the threat on h2 is handled well by the move knight f3. So he played bishop h3, but now after rook d1 I've got a lot of pressure on his d5 pawn. a6. Yeah, this was probably too slow. And again, he sort of pointed this out after the game. Maybe bishop d6 immediately was the way to go. I played bishop d2, and white's pieces are finally starting to get activated. He played knight e4, threatening to win the two bishops. I played rook a to c1, reasoning that this bishop on d2 isn't very good anyway. I mean, it has a lot of potential. If it shows up on this long diagonal, it could cause some serious problems. But I was really worried about my kingside, and thinking that even if he gets the two bishops, I'll have play against the pawn on d5. So what I really want to do is activate my pieces and make sure I don't get checkmated. He played bishop to d6. I played bishop c3, threatening to reveal an attack on the queen. I'm kind of expecting, I think at this point, that he would take that bishop with the knight. He didn't, though. He played queen f6. And this allows me to go knight f3, blocking his threat to get me on the f2 square, and attacking the queen on f6. And after his queen g6, I have knight to h4, hitting the queen again, and she can't move back to f6. Also covering f5. So there is now no square from which the black queen can hit f2, which means I won't have to defend that square next time. He played queen g5, and now sort of the point of these moves for white is that there are more attackers on d5 than there are defenders, so I played queen takes d5. And pieces are flying all over the place, and it's pretty scary, but black is one move shy of being able to do something like knight takes f2, and bishop takes f2, and queen takes f2, because there's tension between the queens. So after queen takes d5, he traded on d5 and played knight takes c3. Excuse me, I gotta pause the video for 1 sec.